We'd have had a real general and a fighting man if we had Wainwright and not a play actor and a bunco man such as we have now. Don't see how a country can produce such men as Robert E. Lee, John J. Pershing, Eisenhower, and Bradley, and at the same time produce Custers, Pattons, and MacArthurs.
That old soldiers never die. They just fade away. And like the old soldier of that ballad, I now close my military career and just fade away. An old soldier who tried to do his duty as God gave him the light to see that duty. Goodbye.
On April 19, 1951, MacArthur made his last official appearance in a farewell address to the U.S. Congress. During his speech, he was interrupted by 50 ovations. With the words "goodbye" uttered, MacArthur concluded his speech, as well as his 52-year military career. Yet, President Truman's decree concerning the iconic figure of MacArthur appeared to stir disquiet among the American populace, casting shadows of doubt and dissent. After Truman's actions were made public, the United States experienced a constitutional crisis and a public relations storm. Opinion polls showed that the vast majority of people opposed Truman's decision to dismiss MacArthur. Letters sent to the White House contained criticisms and condemnations of Truman at a ratio of 1 to 20. By February 1952, 9 months after the event, Truman's approval rating had plummeted to 22%, marking the lowest Gallup poll approval rating recorded by any serving president. People have been speculating about what exactly happened during this time on the distant Korean peninsula. Just hours after the outbreak of the Korean War on June 25, 1950, MacArthur, acting under Truman's authorization, transferred weapons and equipment to the South Korean military to resist the North Korean forces. After that, he led the United Nations Command in the Korean War with initial success. Why was he relieved of all his military positions in less than 10 months? During this period, both President Truman and General MacArthur experienced various events. How did they reach this conclusion? Even to this day, there are differing opinions about what transpired. During the Roosevelt administration, Harry S. Truman, then a senator and later vice president, bore witness to General MacArthur's noted penchant for independent and unorthodox conduct.
He's worse than the Cabots and the Lodges. They at least talked with one another before they told God what to do. Mac tells God right off. It is a very great pity we have to have stuffed shirts like that in key positions. I don't see why in hell Roosevelt didn't order Wainwright home and let MacArthur be a martyr. Guess he was afraid of the sabotage press McCormick-Patterson axis.
From these historical records, it becomes apparent that in 1945, upon Roosevelt's unexpected demise and Truman's assumption of the presidency, Truman had already developed a lack of trust in MacArthur. 1950, the administration announced the end of military support for the nationalist regime of Chiang Kai-shek, then holding his last redoubt on the island before what seemed his final defeat in the Chinese Civil War. Truman hoped that his stance for non-intervention would foment latent hostility by Mao Zedong for Russia, assumed to be near the surface of a man who might break away from Kremlin dictates if Washington encouraged him to believe that it was not hostile to his regime. MacArthur had different concerns, whether speaking to the National Command authorities in the JCS or to the foreign affairs columnist for the New York Times. Formosa in the hands of the communists can be compared to an unsinkable aircraft carrier and submarine tender located to accomplish Soviet offensive strategy. Washington modified its policy toward Formosa after North Korea invaded the South in late June 1950. It was part of a belabored attempt by the administration to build a broad domestic and international coalition including the Robert Taft wing Republicans, who loved Chiang on one hand, and the European socialists in NATO and the UN, who despised Chiang, on the other. The result was a policy of utter confusion. In late July, early August 1950, when the North Koreans had backed UN forces into the Pusan perimeter, MacArthur went to Formosa for a personal inspection, wherein he called Chiang my old comrade in arms and said his indomitable determination to resist communist domination arouses my sincere admiration. His determination parallels the common interests and purpose of Americans that all people in the Pacific area shall be free. Truman hit the ceiling. He had authorized no such endorsement, not even the trip. MacArthur had notified the Pentagon of his intention, but it had informed neither the White House nor the State Department.
Later in the morning, I did not record the exact time the telephone rang, and when I picked it up I heard the faraway voice of John J. Muccio, the American ambassador to the Republic of South Korea. Over a line crackling with static, he told me that very large formations of North Korean infantry, supported by tanks and aircraft, had crossed the 38th parallel at around 4 a.m. and were streaming toward Seoul, the capital, on the main north-south highway. South Korean forces were offering little effective resistance. I called the volcanic Almond. Almond hung up on me and called MacArthur. On hearing Muccio's report, MacArthur replied, "Very well, Ned. Assemble the staff and prepare your recommendations. I will be in at 7 o'clock."
On September 11th, Truman issued an order, NSC 81/1, to MacArthur and UN forces for an advance beyond the 38th parallel into North Korea. MacArthur, busy with the Pusan perimeter defense and the upcoming Incheon landings, had nothing to do with this decision. Truman made another directive later, in light of the possible intervention of Chinese Communist forces in North Korea.
Hereafter, in the event of the open or covert employment anywhere in Korea of major Chinese Communist units, without prior announcement, you should continue the action as long as, in your judgment, action by forces now under your control offers a reasonable chance of success. In any case, you will obtain authorization from Washington prior to taking any military action against objectives in Chinese territory.
MacArthur was very hesitant about advancing north of the 38th parallel and waited for further instructions. Marshall ordered MacArthur on September 30th to feel unhampered tactically and strategically to proceed north of 38th parallel. Truman's directive was sent to MacArthur on October 9th. In the meantime, he had reached another decision.
I want to have a personal talk with the general.
We never waited a minute. We sighted the island, circled it, and sat right down. That's all there was to it. MacArthur was down there on the beach. He had gotten there the night before.
On October 15th, Truman and MacArthur met on Wake Island to discuss the situation of the Korean War. Despite Truman having been president for 5.5 years, this was their first meeting, despite two previous, more indirect attempts by Truman to urge MacArthur to return home, both of which were refused. The meeting on Wake Island was actually Truman's attempt to leverage MacArthur's growing popularity following the Incheon landing for the November midterm elections. He proposed the meeting with MacArthur and suggested that if MacArthur was unwilling to return home, the meeting could be arranged elsewhere outside of the United States. At first, Honolulu seemed the most logical venue, but MacArthur insisted that it was dangerous for him to be away from his headquarters for long, so Wake Island was chosen instead, some 4,700 miles from Washington and 1,900 from Tokyo. Nor had MacArthur even wanted to go the shorter distance to Wake. On the way out from Tokyo, the general was in a foul mood, grumbling constantly to John Muccio, the American ambassador to Korea, about being forced to make the trip. "What a waste of time," he said, "being summoned all this distance primarily for political reasons. Didn't they know that he was still fighting a war?" The primary purpose of the Wake Island Conference was precisely what MacArthur thought, a chance for the president to pose before photographers with the hero of the hour, 3 weeks before the November congressional election that Truman passionately wanted his party to win. Truman, always wanting to avert war with either Russia or China, should have relied on the CIA and State Department political intelligence departments for assessments about decision-making by communist politburos. Instead, he had no qualms about asking MacArthur what are the chances for Chinese or Soviet interference. Nor did he hesitate about accepting MacArthur's immediate response, very little.
I've never had a more satisfactory conference since I've been president,
Truman told reporters later that day. A communique was drafted and initialed by both men, as one reporter on the scene noted, as if they were the heads of different governments. Although Truman's personal popularity plummeted after the Korean War had begun, the Democrats still held a majority in the two houses of Congress after the elections held on November 7, 1950. On October 19, 1950, the U.S. Army's 1st Cavalry Division advanced down the main road and entered Pyongyang. Several hours later, hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops began to cross the Yalu River. President Truman's response to the Chinese attack of November 25 was one of outrage, more at MacArthur than at Mao or Joseph Stalin. 45 days after Wake Island, he wrote his first memorandum for record about his meeting with the general, no longer feeling it was productive to avoid public conflict with MacArthur. Truman would be bitter at MacArthur the rest of his life. He said in 1959,
I considered him a great strategist until he made the march into North Korea without the knowledge that he should have had of the Chinese coming in. That's what caused most of his trouble.
The general, from the president's point of view, either broke the agreement they made back in August not to bring Beijing into the war, or he did not really know what China would do. The latter would mean that the field commander was no smarter than the leading figures in Washington. China's intervention was really a great shocker. In the words of the Secretary of the Army, nobody had expected this at all. Truman, consciously or not, would use MacArthur as a scapegoat for the failure shared by his administration. In the light of the present critical international situation, the gag order, a directive written by George Elsey, White House counsel, was sent on December 6, with a misleading title too strong for its actual content. Its stated justification suggested it was a temporary measure lasting no longer than the present emergency. Clear all public statements on foreign policy with the State Department, military policy with the Department of Defense. Submit them in advance to the White House for information. The Pentagon, 2 days later, sent a clarifying message that contained more escape clauses and equivocations, and 10 of instructions not to prohibit speeches by military on suitable occasions. The so-called gag order went out to all major military commands, as well as all members of the cabinet and the directors of the federal agencies for selective service, price stabilization, economic cooperation, central intelligence, and national resources, hardly what one would call a roundup of the usual suspects possibly guilty of insubordination. The government obviously put its directive
into general terms in order to avoid making it specifically personal to MacArthur.
As George Marshall later testified to the Senate hearing on MacArthur's dismissal. MacArthur, back in December 1950, was certainly not mollified by the pretense that he was only part of a crowd. He wrote a confidant on the 20th, "This has been by far the most open drive from Washington against me, with but little effort to conceal the individuals responsible." However, at least for the time being, he would not defy the executive branch because he felt it must be behind the general criticism leveled on his command during its retreat from North Korea, hence disclosing it was searching for an excuse to dismiss him into retirement. Truman must have sighed a breath of relief for peace on the MacArthur front, at least for the time being. However, once UN forces pulled themselves together under Matthew Ridgway, held off the enemy after a long retreat south, and began to head back to the 38th parallel, MacArthur returned to open words of warning on the 13th and the 20th of February. "We must not fall into the error of evaluating such tactical successes as decisively leading to the enemy's defeat. One presumes the general went public because Washington had not paid particular heed to his secret message sent on February 11th. Unless authority is given to strike bases in Manchuria, our ground forces as presently constituted cannot with safety attempt major operations in North Korea. With Manchuria left intact, the enemy retains the potential to employ a force which will enable him to resume the offensive and force retrograde movement upon us. 6 weeks later, by late March, the front lines were at or near the pre-war boundary between North and South Korea. The Truman administration felt this presented an ideal opportunity for a peace settlement since each side could retain politically its territorial integrity, having held it on the battlefield and hardened its lines. For MacArthur, this simply meant protraction. Red Chinese aggression in Asia could not be stopped by killing Chinese, no matter how many in Korea, so long as her power to make war remained inviolate, he told his staff in March 1951. In impromptu press conferences, he began to call Ridgway's step-by-step movement an accordion war, a term elaborated in his remarks about a heavy cost in Allied blood and the unprecedented military advantage of sanctuary protection enjoyed by the communist side. In ostensible defiance of directions to clear policy statements with Washington, he also made reference to the unification of Korea while confiding in a stage whisper, "This old soldier cannot obtain approval on any statement more significant than a morning report." In 1958, MacArthur told a confidant, in so many words, that the enemy was sitting there naked, without ammunition, without sufficient anything. He could have walked around him and trapped the whole damn Chinese army. As far as he was concerned, the whole thing would be finished. MacArthur said he could not understand why Washington had turned him down flat. At other times, he had an all-purpose explanation. While still on active duty, he felt subjected to a carefully outlined campaign of propaganda to discredit his generalship vis-a-vis the commander of the Eighth Army. This claim, although overstated, reflected an essential fact. From Washington's perspective, to quote Bradley's posthumously published memoir,
"There was a feeling that MacArthur had been kicked upstairs to chairman of the board and was, insofar as military operations were concerned, mainly a prima donna figurehead who had to be tolerated."
Truman had planned to warn the enemy that a prompt settlement of the Korean problem would greatly reduce international tension in the Far East and would open the way for the consideration of other problems in the area. However, MacArthur held his own perspective. There should be no insuperable difficulty in arranging decisions on the Korean problem if the issues are resolved on their own merits, without being burdened by extraneous matters such as Formosa or China's seat in the United Nations. If the enemy still persisted, it could well expect his UN command to depart from its tolerant effort to contain the war to the area of Korea, through an expansion of our military operations to its coastal areas and interior bases would doom Red China to the risk of imminent military collapse. The status of Formosa, long a flashpoint of contention between Truman and MacArthur, had reared its head again. Truman, in these circumstances, could only reply in no comment to questions about MacArthur's proclamation. In late March, the government's immediate response was remarkably circumspect. State Department officials told reporters,
so far as they could determine, MacArthur's statement was not cleared in Washington before he issued it in Tokyo.
Truman simply directed the Pentagon to tell General MacArthur to
directed your attention be called to the order as transmitted December 6, 1950.
That is, make no announcements on policy without government concurrence. In 1955, Bradley told two research assistants working on Truman's memoirs that the message to China
was the straw that broke the camel's back. That was when the president finally gave up.
In the memoir, published the following year, Truman stated without equivocation that MacArthur's message to the enemy on March 24 sealed his fate.
I could no longer tolerate his insubordination.
In the meantime, in a letter MacArthur replied to Representative Joseph William Martin Jr., the Republican leader, he concluded with, "It seems strangely difficult for some to realize that here in Asia is where the communist conspirators have elected to make their play for global conquest, and that we have joined the issue thus raised on the battlefield, that here we fight Europe's war with arms while the diplomats there still fight it with words, that if we lose the war to communism in Asia, the fall of Europe is inevitable, win it and Europe most probably would avoid war and yet preserve freedom. As you pointed out, we must win. There is no substitute for victory. On April 5, Roger Tubby, the president's deputy press secretary, rushed into the Oval Office with a ticker-tape copy of Martin's latest political attack. The Republican minority leader in the House of Representatives just read aloud on the floor of the House the letter from MacArthur critical of Truman's Europe First policy and limited war strategy, and said that our great ally, the established government of the Republic of China, should be released to establish a second front on China's mainland with the force Truman held back on the island of Formosa. Martin went on.
It is high time that the administration and the Pentagon came clean with the Congress and with the American people. If we are not in Korea to win, then the Truman administration should be indicted for the murder of thousands of American boys. The only way to achieve the leadership we so desperately need is by a landslide Republican victory next year.
On April 11th, the day Truman announced the discharge of MacArthur, he told his White House staff that the general, like George B. McClellan in the 1860s, worked with the minority to undercut the administration when there was a war on. Heretofore, partisan Republicans endorsed MacArthur's comments on Formosa, Korea, China, and other sundry matters. He had not endorsed them directly on what seemed a partisan basis. Once he did, he was in Truman's mind a political, not a military, figure as indicated in Truman's diary entries on the 5th and the 6th of April. The situation with regard to the Far Eastern general has become a political one. This video details the events culminating in MacArthur's dismissal. I believe these historical facts have shed light on some uncertainties. Do you hold differing views on Truman's sudden decision to relieve MacArthur during the Korean War? Share your thoughts in the comments. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for the next video.